Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sandhouse meeting of May. We have a wonderful, wonderful presentation today. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Hani Mahmassani, who is our very competent director of the Northwestern Transportation Center. And joining him is also from Northwestern is Professor Joe Schofer, who has a long, long history in transportation. And we have some very nice guests as well. And with that, Hani, please
Great.
start the program.
All right. Thank you very much, Norm, and welcome everyone. As you may be aware, at the height of the COVID-19 lockdown, our center ran a series of asynchronous virtual roundtables on the state of the supply chain and the impact on transportation and logistics networks. Since then, we have been tracking closely how the pandemic has changed demand patterns and how the freight transportation system has not only recovered, but been growing on all four cylinders, albeit with fairly significant changes in what is moving, where, and how. When we had the opportunity to work with AAR to conduct an independent study of how the rail industry has weathered the storm and compare this disruption and recovery to the last Great Recession, and also identify how different sectors had been impacted, especially intermodal, and what the changes we are seeing might portend for the future, we enthusiastically took on that assignment. To conduct the study, I called on my colleague, Professor Joe Schofer, and working with Brett Johnson, our senior associate director, and a PhD student, Max Ng, who is currently part of the audience. We spent the past few months poring over data and mining it for trends and patterns, and also talking to industry, to many participants and stakeholders, from shippers to the railroads themselves, to intermodal service providers, and all companies and entities in the intermodal ecosystem, rail cars, chassis, etc. And I'm pleased that we have this opportunity to share with you some of our, some highlights of our findings, and I will be calling on Professor Schofer to do that. After he shares with us these insights, we will call on our distinguished panelists to share their views on where they see rail in the post-pandemic stretch. And I'm delighted that we have with us today, in addition to Professor Schofer, who many of you, of course, know, he's a professor of civil and environmental engineering and associate dean for faculty affairs in the McCormick School of Engineering and Applied Science here at Northwestern. His research interests focus on transportation and infrastructure policy, particularly performance measurement and management, and evidence-based decision-making for transportation and other infrastructure systems. Many of you may know him for his podcast, his infrastructure podcast, in which he has been running for many years now. We also have with us Mr. John Gray, who's Senior Vice President at AAR, the American Association of Railroads, for Policy and Economics. He conducts and supervises economic, financial, statistical, and cost studies dealing with various aspects of the rail industry. Prior to joining AAR in 2008, he held commercial, operating, strategic, and management positions at the Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, Burlington Northern Railroad, Arco Alaska, and the Alaska Railroad. So he certainly has a well-rounded range of experience here. He has also served in a faculty position at the University of Alaska. A veteran of the US Army, he served as a commissioned officer and was based in Germany for 4 years. We also have with us Mr. John Panzer, who is Senior Vice President for Technology and Strategy Planning at the Union Pacific. John is Senior VP at Union Pacific. He's responsible for all areas of information technology, including application development, infrastructure, and information security. He also oversees the company's strategic planning initiatives, as well as network planning and operations. And so without further ado, I would like to call on Professor Schofer to share with us the insights from this study.
Thank you, Hani. I appreciate your outlining what we did and sort of how we did it. That saves me a bit of time. I want to I'll start sharing my screen so that you will get a reminder of the focus of the study and the cast of characters. And I want to make a special shout out to Max Ng, who in the typical approach of academic studies really did all the work. And we're here in front of you to take most of the credit. So Max did a really good job. As Hani said, we looked at a lot of data provided largely by the Association of American Railroads, but also data that Max pulled together from a long list of federal agencies. So this study was quite rich in data. I think from my point of view, one of the most valuable parts was the opportunity to have conversations with 20 leaders from the industry, from across the industry, to get their perspectives. And in what I'm going to say in the next few minutes, I'm really not so much going to separate those two, but try to bring them together. So COVID-19 was a global natural experiment, not the kind of experiment we might have volunteered to participate in, but an experiment just the same, something brought to us from the outside, which was a major disruption to almost every element of our lives. Our focus here obviously is the railroad industry and supply chains, but the disruptions were far and wide. And from an intellectual point of view, from a managerial point of view, an opportunity like this doesn't come along very often, and that's fortunate, but we need to take advantage of it to learn what we can about performance of systems, how systems can function better, and how they function well under the circumstances. So this was an opportunity, and fortunately, the Association of American Railroads was willing to invest in it as we were. So I think that probably in the planning conversations I had with Brett Johnson, I foolishly said, well, I'll talk about 4 or 5 points of learning. And then it occurred to me, well, I'm not sure I really have 4 or 5 points of learning. So I went back through what we did, and I cobbled together what I think are 5 points that are useful takeaways. So let me see if I can make this work. Okay, so the starting point, and this is a sort of what we learned point. So I want to take credit for one takeaway here. COVID hit the railroads very quickly and hit them hard. Hit the whole supply chain quickly and hard. And what was that due to? I'm telling you something that you all lived. People stayed at home. People stopped going to work. People stopped going to stores. Patterns of shopping, of buying changed. Not only what people were buying, shifting from experiences to consumables, home consumables in particular, but shifting patterns of how people bought. That is, they weren't going to stores as much, and there was much more online buying, delivery, store pickup, patterns like that, and patterns that we're likely to see going forward more than we've seen in the past. So what you see in this chart is the 4-week moving average data of rail freight, which is a summation of car loadings and intermodal cars from the period of the winter of 18, which is on the far left, 2018, through the beginning of 2021. The dip due to the pandemic is here. I hope you can see my cursor. One of the things that was interesting to us is that the very quick drop, so the little balls, the circles here represent measures of industrial production in the United States. Industrial production dropped, rail freight dropped, and rebounded very quickly. So this is the swoop, this is the V rebound. It seemed like a long time, but this interval was about 8 months from roughly from the beginning to the end, and we're not at the end, but the beginning to the end of 2020, the beginning of 21. And one of the things we looked at as a part of our plan was the Great Recession, the 2008-2009 recession. And we have data on that, and I'm not going to show you that, but just to remind you that the rebound period in 2008-2009, the start of the Great Recession, was about 5 years. So this was what one might call a very rapid response. And so part of the takeaway here is the railroads responded well through this recovery. There were some employment losses due to COVID-19 and probably due to changes in operating strategies under PSR. It may have slowed the recovery initially, but things seem to work reasonably well. And we've looked at data on what you might call the core markets of the railroads, and they held up well as well under the circumstances. Bulk commodities, everything took a dip, but bulk commodities were fairly consistent. Manufacturing impacts dropped as manufacturing closed, but then manufacturing rebounded. Agricultural products were probably more affected by tariff wars than by the impact of COVID. And coal continued in a kind of long-term secular decline. The high point was intermodal. So let's go to the second takeaway. Intermodal respond very quickly to the call. So the red line again is intermodal freight, as differentiated from the previous slide, and the little balls here are real personal consumption for durable goods. So that dropped quickly, responded quickly. The image I have is that people started to rehabilitate their kitchens and buy new toys to entertain themselves at home. And intermodal rate responded well. So it's a little bit hard to see, but the zero line here is the week-to-week percentage change. And what we're looking at is changes in the end of 2020, fall of 2020, on the order of 10, 15, 16, 17%. Very quick response. Intermodal jumped to the 2018 high, which is over here, which is, I think, a really surprising and important response. Rail capacity was sufficiently nimble to pick up that intermodal growth, pick it up pretty quickly, and pick up the growth that trucks really struggled to pick up. Rail freight in the end rebounded above what was a 2019 level and was matching the 2018 highs. Max Eng did some really interesting time series modeling in which he started out with assumptions about how the future would transpire. And when he built a model that assumed that the future in 2021 would develop as if the pandemic didn't occur at all, what he found was the actual response was higher than that. That is, the intermodal freight was higher than that. So this is a pretty optimistic response on the intermodal side. And why focus on this? Intermodal, obviously, and I'm sort of speaking to the choir here, intermodal is really important for the rail industry. It's about 56% of the car loadings plus intermodal units. It commands high prices. And what's really important, I think, beyond the group that we have together here today, is that intermodal is at the center of the nation's economy. And it's something not to forget, and I will try to get back to that at the end of my remarks. Intermodal, I think, is also a challenge for the railroad industry, because successful intermodal flows means high performance. It means high efficiency to compete with long haul trucks. It means reliability, which is what the customer wants. And something that's particularly challenging these days is it means shipment visibility. And the variety of people that we interviewed were both complimentary to the rail industry and also said there's room for performance improvement. And I think that's an opportunity for the industry. Also, what we discovered was there were a lot of choke points that affect intermodal. So this was our attempt really to teach ourselves about the complexity of the intermodal process. And I won't walk through this diagram except to say that this is a description, a representation of the flows of intermodal freight in the form of imports coming to warehouses, to retail distributors, and to customers. And what's the point of this? The point of this is to say intermodal freight, not a surprise to those that are deeply involved in the industry, is a complex multiplayer game, as I would describe it. And some people talk about complex processes like this as having a lot of moving parts. And I would look at this and say, it's all moving parts. And there are many opportunities for choke points, for things to go less than perfectly well. What's moving is boxes and chassis and ships and trucks and trains and cars. You know what's really most important and what seemed to have the most effect on the performance of intermodal freight is people, having the people resources to make things go. And I think my personal interpretation is one of the interesting differences between the trucking industry and the rail industry is that the trucking industry is right now extraordinarily dependent on people, and people were a problem. Why were people a problem? Because people got sick, people got COVID, people were afraid of getting sick, and chose not to go into work. And this whole process is dependent on hands-on action. That is, you can't do, this is not a game that you can play on your computer. You have to move real things. One of the things we discovered was that rail cars, availability rail cars, was not a problem. The market seems to balance that well, and there was no shortage of equipment as it was required. On the other hand, not a surprise, congestion was an issue in ports and terminals, particularly in the West Coast ports. So this is a sort of a continuation of a pattern we've seen before, but it was exacerbated, and it was exacerbated to a large degree because of availability of labor, of the people to do the jobs. And what we heard was that boxes were not moving out of the West Coast ports fast enough. Some shippers were using the ports as warehouses. That is, they were allowing boxes to pile up in the ports and drawing them out as they needed them, rather than in a continuous flow. It put the West Coast ports at their physical capacity, and that's a problem that's likely to be something that comes back in the future. There was an insufficiency of chassis, so the chassis allocation process was a serious bottleneck. Why was that? It's not that there weren't enough, it's that there weren't not enough in the right places. The demand for intermodal was up, put pressure on availability. Repair labor was a problem, and so there were a lot of chassis out of service. There are indications that shippers were hoarding and carriers were hoarding chassis to hold back resources so they would be available when they needed them. When you step back and look at that, one might think, well, if we could solve the labor shortage problem related to repair and movement of equipment, we could grow employment. We could envision the possibility of training people to do these jobs. They're likely to be sustainable jobs, and that would be a value to the economy as well as to the industry. The capacity shortfall in the ports extended to the inland terminals as well. So there were a lot of crunch for space and in the inland terminals, and that's one of the reasons why the chassis and boxes were being hoarded and kept out of service. The little circles here represent this chassis flow problem, that chassis need to be at one end and the other end of intermodal flows, but on one end and the other end of the railroads, so they don't move so much from place to place. They move relatively short distances, and availability is an issue. So that's third point. Fourth point is that e-commerce was apparently a driver of this demand for intermodal flows. COVID-19 pressed a lot of us into the e-commerce market. People like me who were not much in that market, but found that I needed things, and e-commerce was the most effective and the safest way for me to purchase and take delivery. So people were forced to experiment, and it's pretty clear that some will go back to in-store purchasing, and many will not go back. So this is a driver of intermodal flows for the futures. And what you see in this data from the Census Bureau, E-commerce has been growing since around the turn of the millennium. This is over here is 2001. The percentages are relatively small, but the volumes are relatively large. And this is a really steep growth, and it's directly attributable to COVID-19. The inbound freight side of e-commerce is obviously important for rail in intermodal. And I mean, I think I don't have to say that that's in part because of the volumes, the large volumes that are involved, and the requirements for efficiency and reliability, which is a part of the game where rail can play most effectively. E-commerce is almost certainly likely to grow, and it's growing not just for the largest retailers, the strong retailers in the market who have the information technology resources. There are third-party providers who are bringing smaller retailers into the e-commerce market, and that's likely to be with us for the foreseeable future. Holding and growing that e-commerce market takes us back to the sort of the requirements for success in the intermodal market. That is high velocity, reliability, shipment visibility, and having the capacity to meet demands. And one of the things that COVID-19 showed us is the importance of the nimbleness to deal with volatility in the retail markets and literally in all markets. And so that, I don't have to tell you, it's just a picture, because I don't really have a slide for this other than to say the disruptions that we experienced under COVID-19 and the disruptions that we experience more routinely due to natural hazards are tests for the supply chain. And there are opportunities, important opportunities, to inform public policy and take private action to assure the resilience and efficiency of those supply chains. I think one of the things that COVID-19 taught a lot of people, and the challenge will be to help them retain that learning, is how important the supply chain is and what it feels like to go to a store or try to buy something online and discover that it's not available, that the delivery times are really long. So COVID-19 was a lesson to me about supply chain centrality in the economy. And my personal observation over the years is that one of the difficulties in learning from events like that, even I would say crisis scale events, is that people have short-term memories. And with all due respect, I think political leadership tends to have a very short-term memory, about half the interval between elections. And yet the care and feeding of the supply chain and the links that make it work are something that needs constant attention and constant valuation. So to me, there's a public education, public policy issue, and making people understand what's important about the supply chain to their daily lives and to the efficiency of their operations, and the role, frankly, that the railroads play in the middle of that supply chain. And that also suggests that it's a good opportunity to remind those involved in the regulatory process that what we need to do is support a kind of balance, support for the various modes that work together in this supply chain, to regulate on the basis of performance and not inputs. And it really to understand something about market dynamics, because market dynamics are not going to stay quiet for the long term. That is, that volatility is something that we need to be prepared for in industry and in the regulatory environment. And finally, an important takeaway from the policy standpoint, from my point of view, is this bottleneck in ports, terminals, inland terminals, warehouses, is not the responsibility of a single actor. It's not a government issue, it's not a railroad issue, it's not a trucking line issue or a real estate issue. It's everybody's issue. And so, and the importance of those facilities is something that I think that's undervalued, and all of the players in the game have some opportunity to jump in and do something that's helpful to make sure that we have the storage capacity, if you will, to sustain the economy at a level that that will bring us satisfaction and success. And that's it. I think I got 5 points in. So I want to get credit for that, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe, for these insights and for sharing with us the story of resilience of the rail industry in the face of these disruptions. I wanted to mention to the audience, please send us your questions using the Q&A feature. I will be monitoring this channel, and then later, after we hear from our panelists, we will be relaying your questions to our panelists today. So with this, I would like to move on and invite our panelists to comment on what Joe has shared with us today. And I will first invite John Gray from the American Association of Railroads to give us some brief remarks on where he sees the future of rail going, perhaps the second half of 2021 and beyond, and if there are any lessons learned during COVID-19 that present opportunities for rail in the future. John?
Thanks, Hani. I think that Joe summed it up pretty well in terms of a lot of the things that we noticed during this. I know that when we went into the pandemic and went into the pandemic mode, in a sense, it was a crisis that the rail industry deals with on a smaller scale, but deals with on a regularly routine basis. It was the type of crisis that where you had potential disruption, that the network had to be reinforced. You had to do things a little bit differently to get through it. Part of the reaction that we had early on to the crisis itself was that there was clearly a concern among the operating officers on the railroads that they would have a shortage of people, and that there would be difficulty in doing all the things that were necessary to accomplish the mission of moving goods. And so for that reason, there was a lot of cooperation between the railroads and the Federal Railroad Administration at that point in time to look at what could be done to minimize the, not necessarily the requirements for operation, but in some cases the reporting requirements. Minimize, and so that you use the people that you had as effectively as possible. So there were a number of waivers to ordinary regulation that were granted early on. It turned out that only 1 or 2 of these were ever used. These waivers were ever used. It was ever necessary to actually use the waiver as we went forward, because it also turned out that there was substantially fewer people that were affected by the virus than we had anticipated early on. And in this, we were very fortunate in a number of ways, not just in the ability to operate the network more effectively because of that, but also simply, for the reason that it, was good for our people, for that to have that feature. But the net effect is that at no time during we met almost daily with the Federal Railroad Administration on this particular issue, and at almost no time during that during the 2 to 3 month period early in the virus, when we had the greatest concerns, were there ever more than about 200 people in the rail industry that were actually down with COVID or suspected of having COVID. And so we had the drop off in industrial production that generated the drop off in traffic. And so the net effect was that we always had the people available to do most of the things that needed to be done in the way that we had traditionally done them. And so in that sense, we were very fortunate in the issue around people. What we didn't understand at the time, and what we've learned since, is that how dependent and interdependent the network is with other parts of the transportation system, not just the railroads, but particularly the ports and the trucking that is associated both with intermodal business and with transload business that we do in other commodities. And the fact that these industries tended to be more affected by the virus and loss of people than we did, became an issue of concern for us downstream. As Joe mentioned, one of the chief reasons that there were problems, and quite frankly continue to be some problems in the ports, was related to the loss of people in the longshore trades in the ports. It's something that continues to affect us, as does the availability of drivers for distribution at inland terminals. So although the initial reaction that we had to the virus in terms of the people availability turned out to be incorrect up front, the fact is that it is exactly as was stated earlier, that a lot of this is a people issue. And it became the availability of people, whether it was in our business or in other parts of the transportation business to which we're linked, that became one of the serious problems for us. Hand it back to you, Hani.
Great, thank you very much, John. I'd like to move to John Panzer then to give us his perspective here, any reaction to what Joe has mentioned, and also where, John, you see the future of rail going, and any lessons learned during COVID-19 that present opportunities for rail in the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Hani. First off, on just a quick personal note, since the beginning of the year, I have moved positions, and now I'm actually responsible for intermodal operations, which has given me a pretty good perspective on what's been going on lately. So I'll add some color there. And also I want to mention, I think everything in Professor Schofer's report, I would say, is dead on accurate from our perspective, particularly around the labor shortages outside of the rail industry, and also to John Gray's point that the railroads didn't have a lot of labor problems because of the measures we took to protect our employees. We had some, but we never were at a point where we were short of crews or track workers and so forth. I'll add a little bit of color here, just in some context. The railroads are pretty good at volume variability. You think big, fixed assets and so forth, but we're actually quite good at adjusting our cost structure to account for swings in business. And we saw that during the Great Recession and during COVID. And that's done by parking locomotives and cars. So they're we're no longer paying per diem. We furlough crews. We don't run trains, so we're not burning fuel, those kind of things. And the advantage we had in 2020 was when business returned rapidly, we didn't lose a lot of workers, for example, that were furloughed. Over time, when you furlough a worker who's been trained and working, the ability to get them back diminishes as time progresses. And so fortunately, we didn't have that issue. Also, the actions of railroads that are, I'll call it PSR related, around being more efficient and lengthening trains also helped. So we were able to recover quite quickly. Another point I want to mention from Professor Schofer's report is, if you remember the chart with the intermodal volumes on it, the peaks that we hit in 2020 and even what we're hitting here in 2021 are high, but they're not necessarily higher than the railroad industry has handled before. So if you think about availability of cars or ramp capacity or the ability of the ports to process freight, that's all supportive of the level of business that's being handled today. But again, I think the big point that hit us back last year and is still an issue today is labor availability. We're dealing with, Union Pacific right now is dealing with a phenomenon that I haven't seen in 20 years in dealing with intermodal, And that's where we have a backlog of freight trying to get on the railroad and a backlog of freight trying to get off the railroad. And we're in this precarious balance of not bringing on too much, but also sensitive to the needs of the ocean carriers and buyers and BCOs to be able to bring freight into the country. To give you some numbers, we run somewhere between 12 and 15 miles of double stack containers off the ports every day. And that's just us, not counting the BNSF, and I'm sure they have at least that much, and an equivalent amount back. And we're running up, Chicago is a good example, running up into where there's a lot of constraints in the inland terminals. And we're resorting to the having to put containers on the ground for lack of chassis, which creates enormous problems when dray carriers try and come in and pick up containers. They're stacked in a way that if you were trying to dig out one particular container, it becomes very time consuming, costly for the lift contractors and so forth, and slows the whole process down. So, I've kind of termed it, we're not only in the transportation business, but we're also in the real estate business, storing all these containers that are wanting to come in. And I still think we're facing constraints, and I don't think I'd get a lot of pushback on this, but I think we're still feeling a lot of constraints from the drayage industry and particularly probably the warehouse industry. We know there's been labor shortages. There's very low unemployment rates in most areas, but also just think of, if you think of the warehousing industry, there's a lot of construction going on. E-commerce is driving that. A lot of goods that were formerly in a store waiting on shelves are now in warehouses. And so there's only so much that the warehouses can process at one time. And I think we're feeling that. And I think this is going to go on for some time. And so we're in this kind of very difficult, precarious balance of trying to help get freight off the docks and not overwhelm our own inland terminals and help and create inefficiencies there. So it's not, I don't know that I would call it necessarily inefficiencies in the chassis availability or the chassis market. It's just that chassis are on the street a long time. There's lots of chassis sitting in intermodal ramps with containers on them that are waiting for a trucker, and the trucker's waiting for a warehouse appointment. So it's just the whole system is backed up, as was well described in the report. And freight just has this way of finding a place to sit. Wherever it can sit, it's going to sit, and that's either on a ship, at a port, at an inland rail ramp, or in a parking lot somewhere. So we're seeing that. Thinking of lessons learned, I've reminded people here at Union Pacific that there's a lot of aspects of this current environment that we don't want to assume will go on forever. I think eventually freight will catch up, and we'll be back to working more towards improving the service product, the reliability, trying to help get freight off highways and onto trains. Right now, it's just more a matter of just trying to move it and find a place to store it. And I wouldn't say service has gone out the window, but it's certainly outside of the parcel business has taken a back seat to just moving freight and trying to do it most efficiently as possible. And God willing, we won't be in an environment forever where we're short of labor because of a virus or something like a worldwide pandemic. And so as I think through what's the future, it's kind of getting back to basics. And visibility was mentioned as something that's important to shippers, integration of the supply chain. So there's control, visibility, efficiency all the way from origin to destination is something that's still being pursued. Technology is supporting that. The railroads are trying to become a part of that and have a ways to go. So again, this is an interesting time, and in fact, from a pure volume and revenue standpoint, it's a great time for the railroads. We feel like we're part of the solution. We're running actually quite fluid. We've had issues where we've had weather in February and an occasional derailment. We're dealing with one right now, but those are somewhat normal. But we're running quite fluid. We have plenty of crews. We have plenty of locomotives. We have plenty of cars. We have real estate options that we're working through. In fact, tomorrow we're calling it a symposium of ocean carrier customers, where we're just talking through what's going on from our perspective. What can we do to help? What are some options? Get feedback from them. Again, their interest is moving ships, moving cargo, getting their containers off the ports. It's very expensive to leave containers on the ports. So we're all in this together. We're all working together. We're working with our IMCs, drayage providers, other railroads, and just trying to keep things moving. And like I said, it's going to be here for a while this year, which is good. It's a sign of a good, healthy economy. And then once it's kind of leveled out, we're probably back to the basics of trying to offer a very good, reliable service product that is innovating, for the future of a more integrated supply chain.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. And thank you to our panelists for also adhering to the time here, so that leaving us with good time for questions. So we have received many questions so far, and please continue asking through the Q&A part. And so I'm going to start with a question to you, Joe. It's from Scott Bernstein. He says, Joe, your excellent illustration of the inbound system raises a different question. What was the role of domestic production and distribution in the pandemic? And what role, if any, did the intermodal rail system play in supporting that? Is the Class 1 model of higher velocity, longer trains a barrier to increasing rail carriage of domestic product? Scott is the founder of the Center for Neighborhood Technology. So Joe, after you address that, we'll also turn it over to our other panelists.
Yeah, I figured we could count on Scott asking a difficult question. The diagram that I shared with you, which Max and I worked on together, was really a training experience to help us understand how the intermodal process worked. And it focused on inbound imported freight. If you looked carefully, and I'm not going to try to show it again, there was a link that related to domestic manufacturing. And that was, to the extent that domestic manufacturing is important in this country, particularly for if you think about the retail market, that was represented there. I didn't emphasize it. So, but certainly intermodal freight served that as well. The strong corridors are the import corridors, and logically the strong import corridors are linked to the West Coast ports, and to a lesser extent the ports on the Gulf. The East Coast ports the East Coast intermodal serves more of the domestic manufacturing market, particularly the automobile industry. We didn't try to represent that there, but that's a strong market, and it's a strong intermodal market.
Thank you, Joe. John Panzer, would you like to add anything to that?
I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I think there was a question there about PSR and the impact and the ability to grow domestic freight. And PSR is about a lot of things. It's about efficiency. It is about long trains, but it is also about good reliable service. I'll put my strategic planning hat back on, and I think part of the future of railroad intermodal growth is going to be serving more markets with probably more frequent, smaller trains. And there are some developments in the works that will help achieve that, I think, as the railroads move to more, we've seen a fall off in coal and other commodities. There's capacity that's created from that. We're getting better at looking at smaller ramps that can operate very efficiently. And that's really the key to making intermodal profitable and reinvestable is being able to have ramps that are very efficient. So for example, we just opened one up in Minneapolis. We're opening another one up in the Inland Empire that are very inexpensive ramps. And I think let's call that beyond PSR, where you're looking at places where you have capacity and opportunities to grow with a different product.
Thank you. So John Gray, I'm going to also give you an opportunity to address that, but I also have another question for you. So I'm going to go ahead and read this, and you can address both. This one is from Cal Silverberg, and he specifically is addressing it to you, John. In my many years of driving between Fort Worth and St. Louis, I see the equivalent of train loads of trucks between Tulsa and St. Louis on I-44 on each trip, What ways are there now that railroads might be able to identify that traffic and make inroads into moving that highway traffic to intermodal?
Well, it's good to hear from Cal, first of all. Addressing the last question first, in terms of the domestic business, I don't think that most people realize it. But if you look at the division of business in the intermodal world for us now, it's about 50-50 in terms of domestic versus international. Now, granted, a reasonably large part of what we call domestic business is the transload business that we see off the international service that is transloaded at the ports. Although it changed, I don't think most people realize that transloading, that business changes form, in which it goes from being a container of maybe one type of good into a container where it is multiple types of goods that are packed for a specific store location inland from the port. So it's not, it is not purely just taking goods out of a 40-foot box and putting them into 53-foot boxes that goes on in those transload centers. Although that does occasionally happen too. But if you looked at the business that was domestic during the time of the most serious part of the pandemic, it actually was at about between 55 and 60% most months that you saw was domestic business rather than international business. And that, of course, changed, and it went back closer to 50-50, even maybe 48% domestic, 52% international late in the year, when you saw the growth in the international business with the reopening of Chinese production and finally the orders and the spending taking place in the U.S. on goods. So we shouldn't discard that domestic business, because it's a big part of what makes the intermodal network work, and it's a big part of what brings volume to some of the smaller markets for that would otherwise not be served directly for international business too. So we have to, the mix of it is important to the structure of the intermodal business in general. Now to Cal's question, St. Louis to Tulsa, how do we attack that? I am with him on the fact that there are lots and lots of these corridors that are 200 to 300 miles long that are difficult have been difficult in the past for the intermodal business to penetrate effectively. If you look at the past models, you'll see that even back in the mid 80s, there were attempts to get into some of these markets. Some of them were effective, usually over a relatively short period, 5 to 10 years. Others were not. And but it became more and more difficult to allocate capacity for some of these smaller markets as the very large volumes of international traffic started coming into the system. And you got to the point where you were filling up your network with long haul traffic. And it became more difficult to go after this short haul traffic, except in very specific markets. I don't know whether St. Louis, Tulsa is one of those markets or not. I guess on that one, I would pass it off to my friends at BNSF on since they have a main line that is directly parallel to that. But it is the shorter markets are tough. I know that they can be done. There are examples around the country where there is capacity where it is being done. One of those I point to is a Class 2 railroad that is, or for now a Class 2 railroad that is actually executing on this, and that is some water business that is being taken off the highway by a bottled water business by Pan Am up in New England. Very difficult market to be in. They've been successful at it. So it can happen, but you've got to have the right ingredients come together to make it happen.
Thank you very much, John. Anybody care to add to this question? John Panzer, perhaps? Oh, okay, Joe. All right, so we have another question here. This is on automation. It's a sort of longer range question. It's from Raymond Hall. It also ties in with the question, in fact, that I had. And Raymond is asking, are railroads, shippers, transport operators increasing their anticipation of automated systems to address labor shortages? And such as automating warehouses, for example. And of course, we hear a lot about driverless trucks being sort of the tip of the iceberg there, and being one area of addressing the labor shortage in the trucking market. It's not clear when that might happen. What is what are the implications, I guess, for railroads regarding that issue? And John Panzer, we'll start with you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I can certainly address that. So I think automation is definitely coming. Autonomous trucks are for real. Union Pacific has taken an equity position in one of the startup companies. I've spent a lot of time with them just to understand what their business model is, how close the technology is to realization, and I think it's coming very quickly. We're probably looking to partner with them to do some autonomous drayage in longer haul markets. And this isn't the intra-city short haul trucking, but if you have a dray that's 100 to 300 miles, it could fit quite nicely into that type of a range. Railroads are looking at, I think everybody knows, railroads are looking at automation of trains in various capacities. We are looking at automated intermodal terminals. Not necessarily fully automated. That's not probably the way to look at it. But if you think of the gate processes, they can become fully automated with machine vision tools, so where drivers aren't being slowed down and having to wait in line when they're coming in and out of terminals. That's coming. I can assure you that. It's already in some railroad ramps are have that implemented. There's cranes that have various levels of automation. We see that on dock, and we're also seeing that with some of the big wide span cranes that are being put together. We're doing some of that now. There's different kinds of, I'll call it automated hostling. There's no level 4, level 5 type hostlers yet, but there is the ability to operate a hostler from a remote location, which could reduce labor costs and increase the pool of available labor. It could be that ultimately we do get to a point where we've got driverless hostlers. So there's a lot of automation coming in the intermodal side and train operation side, and all of that's with the intention of competing with autonomy in trucks. We hear that there'll always be a role for drivers in trucking, and that's probably true. But I think it's coming, and I think there's a place for rails to participate and compete effectively in it.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Anybody else care to elaborate on this, Joe?
No, I think it was well said. I mean, I think anyone any observer that thinks of railroads are going to roll over and play dead in the face of automation in the trucking industry is making a mistake.
Thank you, John Gray.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of important points to make on that, and one is that a key to some of the automation processes that are going on in the industry is the installation of positive train control that took place over the past 12 years. It's a critical element. It's most obvious as an element in the ability to play a role in the automation of train movements themselves. But I think there's at least as critical a role as that in other areas of automation. Its role in those other areas comes not from the direct system itself, but from the communication systems that were created in order to be able to support positive train control. Because the industry had to create communication systems on a private scale for industrial use that are probably better and bigger and more complex than just about any communication system that national network that is out there today. And with huge amounts of capacity to do a lot of this work. And what that has allowed the industry to start doing is taking a lot of other automated systems and integrating them into the process of management, not just of train operations, but of unexpected events. And by unexpected events, I mean the little things that can go wrong out there that will delay trains, create service problems, all kinds of things like that. And it may be things as simple as detection of a flaw in a wheel or axle. What do you do with that flaw? Do you set out the car at the next siding, or is the flaw something that you can move to a location where it can be serviced correctly? Well, all of a sudden, between the systems that we have for detection, plus the communication system that allows you to do the analysis of the type of flaw and how it is used, you have the ability to manage those things more effectively. And that's important, not just in managing the cost of the operation, but also the service product that ultimately gets to the customer. And I think that the automation is giving us a key to be able to manage those service products much more effectively than the industry has in the past, because those disruptions are the things that are the most problem in creating a lot of the consistent service that we need to have.
Thank you, John. This actually begs the question that I've been receiving, particularly from John Struthman, about cybersecurity and what business effects essentially cyber incidents might have had in the rail industry, or as one is sort of preparing for some contingency planning and so on, where sort of cybersecurity might fit in the spectrum of considerations here, particularly with what happened with ransomware in connection with the pipeline, for example. So John Panzer, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'd love to. I did a couple year stint as our CIO and spent probably 40% of my time on cybersecurity. So I'm not an IT expert, but I do have a lot of perspectives and a lot of recent ones. So the railroads are very, very cognizant of the risks of cybersecurity. You know, we all have big teams. We employ consultants and have structures where we're going through and making sure our most vulnerable systems are protected. PTC is an area where the industry hired a team to come in and look for the vulnerabilities in that system. And I think the report card would say why your job is in cybersecurity is always to be be cautious and expect that there's somebody that's going to attack you at any time. That we are in pretty good shape. We protect our core data center systems most carefully, and then we do have a lot of remote assets, whether it's PCs in the field, local computers on locomotives and so forth. But there's firewalls, there's detection systems. I mean, the best defense in cybersecurity is detection systems to be able to watch as a hacker would try to move around the system. So while nobody is invulnerable to a cybersecurity attack, there is a lot of attention going to it, and the report cards that we've gotten from external sources say that we're very well protected and looking at it appropriately. And I think that's true for most of the other railroads as well. But then as you think about things like automated trains, that just brings in another whole level of concern and security that you're going to need around that system. But the PTC development has been very helpful in getting our heads around those types of risks.
Thank you. Joe, do you care to add anything to that cybersecurity threat?
No, other than the fact that the report that we put together did identify that as an issue going forward.
Thank you. John Gray? You're on mute.
Yeah, not really much to add to what John said. I think he summed it up well. I would note that our part of the business is heavily involved in that. And as he mentioned, spending 40% of his time on it, there are times that I wish that were only 40%. So
Right.
but there is, it is exactly as he said. You're never invulnerable to it, but all you can do is just keep working, trying to stay ahead of the curve on it, and it's an intense task, but it's one that the industry has recognized that this is absolute necessity.
Thank you. So there's a question from Tom Murtha, who's a senior freight planner with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP. And he has a question for Mr. Panzer. The railroad industry has sought to consolidate facilities. For example, UPRR recently closed the Global 3 terminal in Rochelle, Illinois. If the alternative is grounding containers, might the railroads take a closer look at the need for reactivating these facilities?
Well, that's a great question. We actually are reactivating Global 3. I mentioned earlier, we're in the real estate business. So for those that don't know, the Global 3 facility in Rochelle is quite a ways west of the city, and we used it for some time as an intermodal ramp, and it's mostly idle. We use it for switching. But yeah, we have consolidated into two big terminals, primarily in Chicago, and are still under the process of making those terminals bigger and better in terms of their capacity. And we did that because it's so much easier for everybody involved to run operations out of one or two terminals in each city versus having 4 or 5. You just can't practically have services from every origin to every destination going into every terminal. So it's going to be much more efficient. But in the just for the interim time period, we do have that space available, and we're going to start running some trains in there and storing containers for the ocean carriers that was actually a request that they had. And so again, I think this is an example of the railroads being part of the solution to some of the challenges that are going on in the supply chain these days.
Thank you. John Gray, care to add anything to that?
No, other than that, my phone call, my conference call that I had right before this one was with the Chicago Planning Group that was working on that issues, and we were working on some issues around another of those terminals like that. And so, yeah, it's something that's under active review and discussion almost on a continuous basis.
Thank you. So I have a question from Michael Blazak, who is asking a question that I'm going to ask you, John Gray, about first. He noticed what appears to be a significant increase in the volume of trailers and containers on chassis moving in intermodal service since the pandemic began. Assuming these are domestic movements diverted from motor carriers, do you foresee the railroads retaining this traffic, and what are the prospects for growth?
Well, and this is almost a loaded question, because Hani and I have had a discussion on this very issue about 2 weeks ago, I think. But you correctly observed that there was about a 200% to 300% increase in the number of trailers. I think that prior to the pandemic, we were doing trailers at about the rate of 7,000 to 8,000 a week. And during the pandemic, we peaked at around 26,000 trailers one week. And it's still running well over 20,000 trailers a week, even now. Now, it took a little work, but we went out and see if we could identify, what the trailers were. And the more we looked at the data that we did have available, the more it became evident that the trailers were what they had always been, which was movements by the small package carriers, the UPSs, FedExes, LCL, or LTL operators, and that it became pretty clear when you started talking to some of these folks that it was from what they were seeing as a part of the increase in internet shopping, and that it was their expectation that this trend might moderate a little bit, but that the basic business was there. Now, do we see that as something that will necessarily move long-term in trailers? Not necessarily, because if you look even at these operators, there was a move afoot to put this business to the extent possible into domestic 53-foot containers. And so is it sustainable over the long term? I don't know whether it is, but the important thing is that they believe the underlying business will be sustainable.
Okay, great. Thank you. Joe, care to mention that? I know it was part of our study.
No, it's other than, yes, we see the same trend, and it's a really strong trend. But I think John's explanation is a good one, that it may continue in volume, but in the nature of the box may be different.
Thank you. John Panzer?
I don't have a whole lot to add. I'll be honest, I haven't noticed the increase in trailers that much. They are a little more challenging to handle just because of the car types, just having the right car types at the right time. But we do, it is a good mechanism for motor carriers to begin to use intermodal, or use it in certain lanes where they may not have containers, or they don't have the balance, or it just fits their network. So I think it's going to be here, always be a part of intermodal, but certainly the container side is much more efficient.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to combine now several questions that I have received, particularly about combine three things. One, of course, is COVID-19 and health impacts. Also related to that is essentially how, what kind of transformations in terms of healthy transportation, so to speak, that's related to that. So the questions are from Carl Kim and also from Gokman Ergun, and the question there is that given the importance of people, especially in terms of intermodal shipping, did you get sufficient data on infections, testing, incidence of disease, and other public health data to support planning and any changes in operations? And sort of adding to that is the so-called concept in transportation, namely healthy transportation, and essentially how, sort of what kind of changes might have been done to deal with that. And I mentioned, and we've talked a lot about these kind of issues, but if one is looking forward to, other similar health issues that may arise, I think there may be some lessons to learn, again, from the standpoint of how the sort of the disease itself and any kind of measures, et cetera, might have impacted planning and operations. So who would like to take that one first?
I'll take a real quick shot at it, because this is not something that I'm an expert on. However, we did hear in the interviews that we did from various people in the industry that sufficiency of labor was an issue, and that it related to two issues. One is people were ill, and the other was people were quarantined. I think what's important about looking forward, and when you think about these kinds of problems, is that people, and others have already said this, people are central to this activity, and you can't forget that. And one of the missions is to assure that you have the resources to move the freight, and people are a core resource. And I think the railroads, one of the messages we got from the railroads was that social distancing wasn't so much an issue for them, because people, the field labor are quite dispersed. But it's something to think about across the board, and we've seen it in other disruptions that particularly the transportation center has looked at, where in response to natural hazards, hurricanes and tropical storms in particular, you need to take care of your people to keep the system running.
Thank you. John Panzer?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. Again, not an expert in this area either, but I will note, and as we lived through the pandemic, our company made it very clear to our employees that we are a critical component of delivering goods that the nation needs to stay healthy and to live and survive. And so we did everything we could, of course, to keep people safe, from sanitizing locomotive services, mask wearing, social distancing, tracing, testing, everything we could do. But we did ask employees that to come to work, to be there. It was absolutely critical that we did so. As Professor Schofer mentioned, we have an advantage that we don't have to put people right next to each other necessarily, except in the cab of a locomotive, and the track gangs could work at a distance and so forth. So I think there's a sense of pride that we managed it well, and the employees felt a tremendous sense of pride during the lockdowns, that they were helping the country. We had very little layoffs, very little people that didn't show up, very few people that didn't show up for work. People weren't taking vacations even. And so I think the reaction's good. I don't know how that transpires into the future and what that means for healthy transportation going forward. But I think I think what the railroad industry did was set a good example for the country.
Thank you. John Gray?
Yeah, I'd say that just to reiterate that the Federal Railroad Administration was keeping pretty close track on what the employee count was day to day that was affected by the virus, and the numbers. You look at the number of longshoremen in Los Angeles that had a problem, and there are numbers there that are around at their peak 600-700 of them that were out for various health reasons, and that's on a population of a few thousand employees. On a population of about 120 to 130,000, we never got numbers that high. As high as they had there on a population that numbered in the 4-digit thousand. Ours in the 6-digit never got as high as theirs.
Great, thank you. So I have a question here, and Joe, I'm going to start with you on that one. This is from Arnold Kasamsarn. He asked, given that coal has been a large proportion of rail traffic for a very long time, what have been the overall changes in rail traffic patterns that respond to the increase in available capacity and to make up for revenue? In other words, the fact that coal has been, has been a smaller, I guess, share of rail traffic, the decline that we saw in our analysis.
If there's anything in the way of good news for the railroads, when you look at the coal sector, it's been very consistent, and that is, it's been a long-term secular decline. So plenty of opportunity to plan and to adjust. So where's the capacity gone? I think my colleagues from the railroad industry will be better prepared to answer this than I will. But you have to think about some regional differences because of where coal is produced and where it's consumed. But intermodal has sucked up capacity, which is, I think, a really good thing, a better thing for the for the industry, for the nation, and some other products. So I don't think that railroads are hurting. I'm sure there are people in the industry that would disagree with that, but I don't think they're hurting badly from that loss, and they've had plenty of time to adjust and to prepare. And I don't think there's any doubt that that's going to continue.
John Gray, you've been a long-term observer, of course, an analyst of the situation. What's your take?
Well, I think that Joe was pretty close on it. That you know, the coal thing peaked in 2008. It's been declining ever since. The 2020 was a particularly severe year. There was 1 week when there were only 45,000 carloads of coal loaded. That compares to 2008 when there were weeks when there were 155 to 160,000 carloads of coal loaded per week. So it's been something that has been in long-term decline. If you look at the performance of the carriers, though, financially, and in terms of the revenue performance, you'll note that the numbers there have not suffered particularly from the decline in coal. Would we be happier if we were doing everything we're doing now plus a little bit more coal? Yes. But the reality is that there's been a substitution of other commodities. Intermodal has been critical on that. The other thing that is becoming a critical part of that is the chemical business, because the same economic items that cause the decline in coal, which is low natural gas prices, have also brought huge investments into the chemical industry. The last numbers I saw, it was over $200 billion of new investment that's taken place in the past 5 to 6 years in the chemical industry, and that is a solid industry for the railroads. It has been for a long time. It has been an industry that has been its growth is slow, but it's been very dependable over time, and so. There is very good reason to believe that between the things like the intermodal and the chemicals and a few other ancillary businesses, that we will be able to handle the decline that we've seen so far in coal. I'd add that 10 years ago, coal was the largest thing that the railroads handled by a fair margin in terms of the revenue from it. Today, it's the third item. It's number 3 on the list, behind the intermodal and the chemicals. So we have seen a transformation. I would add that transformations like that cost money. Because the physical plant that you need to handle coal is not the same physical plant necessarily that you need to handle chemicals and intermodal. They're not necessarily, there's not a lot of demand in central Wyoming for intermodal business as there is with coal operations. So it's not a one-to-one change out, but the fact is that the industry has adapted, and it is the adaptations have taken place that let us handle what remains of the coal efficiently, and to handle more efficiently than we have in the past the newly growing items.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask one last question, and I'm sort of going to go around on that one, and I will start with John Panzer on it. And this question is about intermodal. So we'll close on that subject. And so we've received several questions on intermodal, one of which is a very broad one that asks, this is from Gursimran Singh, who asked, what are the major bottlenecks of intermodal transport system in general? So that's a big question. You can sort of pick and choose within that. And another sort of related question to intermodal that David Lielbach is asking is, are the railroads turning on intermodal trailer blocks in new lanes, or are they mostly the typical parcel lanes / terminals? And finally, also related to that is kind of, and this is something that you've alluded to already, John, which has to do with terminal capacity specifically, and sort of the role of railroads in addressing this limitation. And that, again, you've mentioned several elements of that. So we'll start with you, John Panzer, and we'll kind of go around and close with
Okay,
that.
I can probably be fairly brief. So, I talked earlier about the constraints that we're facing right now, just due to the backlog of freight that's coming in from overseas, and just the high demand everywhere, and the impacts of labor and so forth. Other than that, I don't think that the railroads would say that there are a lot of capacity constraints in intermodal. As you grow, we need to buy more cars. That happens. Containers, that happens. There is a concern, I guess, now that I think about it, around chassis availability, and whether the ability to bring chassis into the country from overseas with the tariffs that are currently in place, the ability of domestic manufacturers to keep up with demand. You've heard companies like J.B. Hunt and Hub and Schneider looking to buy thousands of new containers, and chassis are going to be needed for that. And I think right now, despite the slow cycle times on chassis, there wouldn't be enough chassis to handle the demand as it is. And I think that that may be a short-term problem, tariff related, or it may be a longer-term problem. I don't know. Otherwise, if you're thinking of constraints, you have to get down to the terminal level again. And there's always places that are more or less constrained, and the railroads, I think, do a great job of investing where they need to build new terminals, expand terminals. We're doing a lot of that. We've been doing a lot of that. So the big challenge in a terminal is parking, and what you have is freight that gets to destination, and it likes to dwell a day or two or three, and trying to minimize that. And so that's where I think, again, integration with shippers and IMCs and so forth to help speed up that delivery process, railroads being more on time, that type of thing will help alleviate that. But again, there's nothing fundamental that's going to keep the railroads from growing intermodal. And then lastly, on the trailers, I think my answer is no. There's really, if we think of new intermodal lanes, like say Minneapolis that we've opened, there may or may not be trailer service associated with that. For example, that one's purely containers. But we're not opening new trailer only or predominantly trailer type lanes. We're just looking at, whatever lanes that we think could sustain growth in general.
Great. John Gray, bottlenecks.
I think that there's there's some interesting issues around the whole dynamic of the growth of the intermodal business. Constraints to it. I think a constraint that I've seen that concerns me is one that John just mentioned, and that's the chassis availability. It's very real for both the international business, and because the chassis are produced outside of North America, also for the domestic business. It's something that is probably, in terms of the capacity development, it's the biggest concern that I would have. Containers, yeah, there's some, they are also produced outside North America predominantly, but we were successful in not getting a tariff applied to 53-foot container production, simply because there wasn't a viable alternative in North America for that production. So that was about a 2-week project, as I recall, on doing the work on that. But that is less of a concern because it's probably easier to develop something if you had to in North America. Rail cars, everything we use is produced in North America. There may be components that are produced outside, but those components are universally available within North America. We don't have to worry about the rail cars themselves. Yeah. And then the other limitation is space. You know, in terms of space, the reason it is a concern is the space that is available is usually not exactly where the warehouses are that you need to, that are going to be using that space, which means you need to be able to dray to various to and from various locations from your terminal. Why is the space a concern? Because even though you can find the physical space, you do have that dray. And the ability to do drays, particularly in some of the shorter, in some of the more dense markets, is going to be more and more difficult simply because of congestion, local congestion. And so that is one of the areas that I do have a concern on. The other concern is, as John mentioned, is the fact that there is so much parking demand at intermodal terminals. I think that it's important to remember that the whole concept of just in time is now and always has been something of a fraud. That the reality is that someone somewhere is, when you've got a box that has been en route for 6 or 8 weeks, which is what a box from China has been doing, somehow, somewhere, someone is storing it for, to make sure that it gets delivered on that at that just-in-time point. And too often, the inclination is to try to store it in one of the intermodal terminals. And if you let that happen, it does exactly what you see going on out in Los Angeles today along the docks. And so that would be my other concern.
Thank you, John. Joe, bottlenecks.
Well, we talked about bottlenecks, and what I would, the point that I would make is that intermodal is not just the railroads. And I think that my colleagues have highlighted that. And if there's a focal point for long-term concern, it's terminals, it's storage, which when you think about a logistics system is a kind of not very interesting integral part of the process that is essential to make it work. And to me, there are 2 parts to the terminal or storage issue. One is capacity to hold boxes, and the other is throughput. And they trade off against each other. Fixing one may resolve a problem in the other. And throughput to me relates to equipment, which takes us back to chassis, which has been the bottleneck during COVID-19, and people, the other bottleneck. So we have, if we're going to solve this problem, if we're going to address it, we need to look at equipment, people, and space.
Thank you very much, Joe. So final closing thoughts from everyone. 1 minute. John Gray, we'll start with you.
Well, first of all, it's been nice talking to all the folks here. I think that the work that you folks have done in developing the issues around what we've seen, not just happen during the pandemic, but some of the implications that come out of that for downstream has been really useful work in terms of the debate that can be created around that. I think it's focused on a part of the economy that, as you said earlier, is often ignored, the supply chain. and it's helped emphasize. It's been one more item within the arsenal to emphasize the importance of high quality supply chains for any type of successful economic growth.
Great, thank you. John Panzer?
Yeah, I don't think I have a whole lot to add. I really appreciate the time to talk with everybody and learn from everybody. Professor Schofer, I thought your report was dead on, very accurate. Again, I think we're in a situation that's somewhat unique due to COVID, but that the opportunities for rail and to fit where it does in the transportation industry are fantastic, and we look forward to being a part of it.
Thank you. Joe?
I would leave you with 3 words: complexity, the implications going forward, and centrality. Complexity, it's one of the things that I've learned from this experience is that the system and the process are together very complex, and make them interesting and make them challenging. So when everybody goes back to their day job, they'll have plenty to do, and that's encouraging. Implications, yes, there are lessons to be learned and jobs to be done in the future that go well beyond COVID, because there are many other disruptions, large and small, to which the supply chain and the rail industry must respond. And the third is a message for people, maybe the ones that are not sitting in on this discussion, and that is the centrality of the supply chain system to the nation's security and economy.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So this webinar will be or has been recorded, and then will be shared through our website. Similarly, the final report from the study that we reported on today will also be available through our website within the next couple of weeks as the report gets completely finalized. And with that, I'd like to thank our audience today for their participation and turn it over to Norm. Thank you, Norm, for hosting us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hani, and thank you to Joe, John, and John. I think that this has been very, very interesting, very informative, and Joe, it has clearly been a teaching experience, so you certainly fulfilled your mission stated there. It was also interesting to me to note that on a very, very short notice, we had 175 people participating in this event. And I think that is a record for a Sandhouse meeting, Hani. And I think it tells of the importance of the discussion and how pertinent it is to everyone's lives today. Looking forward to our next meeting, Brett and I are working with Justin Zubrod. We are continuing the focus on supply chain and logistics. We will hopefully be picking a date here in the short term in June, and then announcing the meeting. We believe we're going to take July and August off and resume the schedules in September. And with that, again, thank you to everyone that participated in this and worked on it, as well as the student who did all the underlying work. We should thank him as well. And we look forward to seeing many of you back in June. And at that point, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.